Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something absolutely fascinating and honestly, incredibly consequential: the hidden impact of language in court verdicts. We usually think of judicial rulings as these perfectly objective, totally dry recounts of facts and laws. But what if they aren't? What if the actual grammar used in a verdict subtly, maybe even unconsciously, shifts who is held accountable? Well, using a meticulously researched paper by Manwar Shur and Amjad Salim, we're going to unpack the invisible architecture of legal language. Just to anchor us before we really get going, it's important to note that this research was published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Academic Research for Humanities. So we're looking at some seriously rigorous objective analysis here. The researchers take an empirical linguistic framework and apply it to a highly sensitive, tragic text. A 2018 appellate decision from the Lahore High Court about a case of child sexual abuse and murder. By looking at this through an academic lens, we can see exactly how institutional language operates in the real world without any sensationalism. Okay, let's look at our roadmap for navigating this text. We'll kick things off with a context and problem statement, move into the methodology and framework, do a deep dive with a linguistic clause analysis, discuss the major findings, and wrap up with the implications and a call to action. All right, Section 1. Context and problem statement. The weight of judicial words. So, back in 2018, sexual assaults on minors in Pakistan saw an 11% increase. We're talking roughly 10 children being abused every single day. Against this intense backdrop, the researchers quote Hussein and Bari to really frame the gravity of these crimes. Because rape is so often viewed not just as a physical crime, but as an attack on quote-unquote honor, reputation, and self-respect, victims end up facing this massive social stigma. All too often, societal concerns about honor unjustly shift the blame, leaving survivors totally isolated and ostracized. The authors really want us to keep this societal backdrop in mind as we see how the courts, the ultimate arbiters of justice, choose to write about these victims. Moving right along, Section 2, Methodology and Framework, Unpacking the Grammar of Justice. Now, to truly spot the bias hiding in a legal text, you can't just look at the emotional words. You have to look at the structural grammar itself. The researchers tore down this 2018 appellate judgment using a framework called Systemic Functional Linguistics, or SFL for short. And hey, if you're not a linguist, don't sweat it. The concept is actually super intuitive. Basically, SFL views language as a tool for making meaning. The researchers looked at the text on 3 different levels. First, standard transitivity, which is just looking at who is doing what to whom. Second, ergative transitivity. That's tracking active versus passive voice to see who is actually given agency. And third, textual metafunction. That just means looking at what info gets placed at the very beginning of a sentence to make it stand out. The big takeaway here? By tracking these specific grammatical choices, we can reveal exactly who the court holds accountable and who it lets slip into the shadows. Section 3. Linguistic Clause Analysis, Deconstructing the Verdict. Let's move to the text and see how this actually builds. Take a look at this first clause pulled straight from the judgment. A little girl, Z, was raped and strangulated to death after abduction. On the surface, sure, it states the horrible facts. But look a little closer. Who is conspicuously missing from this sentence? The perpetrator. The violent action is happening, but the person actually committing that action, completely absent from the text. If we map out this grammatical structure, you'll see the medium or the goal of the action is the victim, denoted as Z. The process is a passive material verb, but the actor or agent, the perpetrator, is entirely omitted. Structurally speaking, the perpetrator is literally exempt from grammatical accountability in this sentence, while the victim is thrust right into the foreground. And this brilliantly shows us the stark difference between an active and a passive construction. An operative or active sentence would say, the appellant raped and murdered Z. Boom, that firmly assigns responsibility. But instead, the court repeatedly relies on receptive or passive constructions like Z was subjected to rape. As the researchers point out, this shifts the entire focus onto what the victim experienced while totally obscuring the criminal intent of the perpetrator. It's almost as if the crime is framed as something that just naturally happened to the victim, like bad weather. Let's check out another really striking example from the judgment. Z took her last breath. Wow, the phrasing here is super revealing. Instead of just stating that the appellant killed the victim, the sentence makes the victim the active agent of her own death. The researchers note that this basically functions as a euphemism. It brings this detached formality to the tragedy, and once again, it completely detaches the perpetrator from the actual act of murder. In fact, across all 3 levels of this SFL analysis, the victim remains the focal point every single time.
In standard transitivity, she's the actor. In ergative transitivity, she's the agent. And in textual metafunction, she is the theme, placed right there at the start of the sentence. So, the victim is forced into the position of the psychological, grammatical, and logical subject, while the person who actually committed the crime, nowhere to be found in the grammar.
Section 4. Major findings and discussion. The embedded bias. Okay, we see this fascinating tension in this sixth clause analyzed in the paper. The little flower was plucked and mutilated by the appellant. Here, the court is using highly emotional, subjective language, the little flower, obviously trying to evoke sympathy for the victim. But notice the grammar. It is still a passive construction. The emotional language is trying to offset the passivity, but it still shoves the perpetrator to the very end of the sentence. The true agency of the offender is still grammatically minimized. So, summarizing the major findings, the researchers found a few huge recurring patterns. First, agent omission, meaning the perpetrator is frequently hidden. Second, thematic foregrounding. The victim is constantly made the subject of the sentence. Third, receptive voice, framing the crime as just something that occurred. And finally, the text even subtly associates the victim's own movements, like simply leaving her house, with a crime that followed. Together, all these linguistic choices weaken that absolutely crucial link between the offender and the violent act they committed. And it's important to note, these microscopic grammatical choices aren't necessarily some deliberate bias by the judge. Instead, they reflect broader, unconscious patriarchal assumptions that are just deeply embedded in conventional legal and institutional discourse. Section 5. Implications and call to action. Why judicial words matter. So why should we care about nouns and verbs in a dusty legal document? Because the real-world ramifications are absolutely massive. Judicial words carry immense weight. When a court consistently removes active intent from its grammar, it unintentionally normalizes sexual violence. It subtly shifts the focus, and by extension, the blame, right onto the victims. And since legal texts often set the tone for media reporting and public discourse, these grammatical habits end up retaining and spreading harmful stereotypes. At the end of the day, it completely undermines the public's perception of strict criminal accountability. Which brings us to the researchers' main conclusion. There is a critical, urgent need for linguistic awareness in legal drafting. Judges, lawyers, legal drafters, they need specialized training to understand how their grammatical choices literally shape reality. By making criminal agency explicit and ditching those passive constructions that hide responsibility, the legal system can finally ensure more accurate, balanced, and fair representations of violence. You know, the rigorous analysis we've explored today is exactly the kind of impactful scholarship supported by BVOR Researches International. If you're a researcher, a faculty member, or a graduate student wanting to publish high-quality research that actually contributes to global scholarship, and you want to share findings that can drive meaningful change, you should definitely consider submitting your future manuscripts to their journals. We've seen today how the invisible grammar of justice shapes our reality. Think about it. If the very sentences deciding the fate of perpetrators fail to hold them grammatically accountable, how on earth can we expect society to do so? I highly encourage you to scan the code on your screen to read the full, incredible study by Mahoner Shar and Amjad Salim. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, keep questioning the words that shape our world.